As the UFC continues to become more popular and more mainstream, there is an increasing worry that things will eventually collapse. At first glance, it looks like the UFC is just too big to fail, just like all the other sports leagues, but there are quite a few gaps that need to be filled, and if not, they very well could have disastrous impacts on the future of the UFC. The first issue that immediately jumps out to me is that the popularity to accessibility balance is becoming more and more askew. It doesn't need to be equal, but it has to make sense. As much as I like the Paramount deal, it only affects the United States, and it seems like it has just switched places with the pricing of live events. Comparing 20-30 years ago to now, tickets used to be cheaper, but getting pay-per-views used to be more expensive. Now pay-per-views are being phased out, and that loss of revenue is being filled by the ludicrous ticket prices. The prices for both companies under the TKO banner have been raising at an exponential rate, and then we get these sorts of quotes from executives like Mark Shapiro, who also has said in the past that there isn't a big deal between the UFC going to the Apex versus going to actual arenas. That's what first put him on my radar, but just the other day he came out here and said in no uncertain terms that the UFC will just follow the money. At least Dana had the foresight to lie a little bit and talk about, weighing options and finding a good fit for each event. No, this guy just came out and said it. This attitude combined with the Paramount deal creates this weird situation where the TV is more important than the live experience. Obviously, you're going to reach more people through event broadcasts, but to neglect the in-person fans to the level at which they currently are and plan to continue to, I think is a mistake. If someone's first exposure to a UFC event is watching it on TV, I feel like the passive nature of just watching it would lead to less conversion of long-term fans, as opposed to someone experiencing it in person. Right, even though I've never been to an event, I personally feel this sort of connection to the crowd when I'm watching these events in arenas. They make it a big deal, they add this sort of atmosphere, right? You throw Royval versus Van in the Apex, and I'm not saying that it ruins the fight, but the crowd's slowly getting louder over the course of the 15 minutes, and then coming to this fever pitch when Joshua Van knocked Royval down and clinched the round is cinematic. The crowd helps a fight to crescendo. All that stuff helps to build a healthy sport and a healthy dynamic. People sometimes get on me for talking about MMA's storytelling capabilities, right? They say, go watch pro wrestling, go watch a movie. That's fair to a degree, but there's something different about sports storytelling, especially MMA, where it's just two guys trying to move forward in their lives. They're trying to impose their vision, and it doesn't always go their way. I think, a filmmaker, as long as things are produced well, will usually fulfill his vision. The uncertainty of MMA and somebody else directly opposed to your vision is one of MMA's biggest strengths. Royval vs. Van was a star-making performance in part because of the story and the crowd rallying behind an underdog who's showing up on a couple weeks' notice, right? Imagine Anthony Hernandez beating the brakes off of Roman Dolidze with a crowd just wailing. Think about Noche UFC with Lopez vs. Silva and that crowd. This is just the last couple of months as well, but I can guarantee that you're comparing these performances, you're thinking about maybe other performances that didn't quite live up in the Apex, and there is a tangible difference. Ribovic versus Brenner and Rebecki versus Duncan, both being back-to-back in the Apex, should be a federal crime. Those are both top 10, top 15 fights of this year. Maybe even you can push one of those probably top 5. I would say Rebecki, Duncan probably a little bit higher, but both are just phenomenal. Happening back-to-back in a fucking warehouse for 20 people to watch. It's just horrid mismanagement. But the Apex is just so easy for the UFC to go to that it's hindering the product at this point. Fuck, I forgot about Cannonier versus RoboCop. No one even remembers it because it was a shit card in the Apex. But the storyline of Jared resurrecting himself would have been incredible in front of a crowd. So we circle back to why. It's these goddamn site fees. The UFC wants to make Ian Gary a star, but they won't do an event in Ireland because the government won't pay them. They have 2 Australian champions, but refuse to put them on Australian pay-per-views. The UFC loves to push for the Mexican market. They have a PI down there. It's so cool. But Noche was 28% Brazilian and only 17% Mexican. They're willing to look past the humanitarian issues of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, and the United Arab Emirates, but God forbid they go to Spain, South Africa, Poland, Ireland, Italy, or Philadelphia. There are major cities in the United States that still haven't gotten an event since pre-COVID. Do you understand how silly that is? Big cities. If I remember correctly, the UFC wasn't at Chicago till 319. They had multiple years to go to Chicago, one of the biggest cities, I think, in the U.S. I'm not a U.S. expert, but I think Chicago's pretty big. They have a lot of fighters from there. They have Bilal Muhammad. He has shooters. There's a bunch of guys from there. But why would we go there? We have people from there. We need to go somewhere where we don't have people. We need to go to China. Who do we have in China? Zhang Weili. She only fights once every 10 months. She hasn't defended a belt in China. Missed opportunity? You could have put her versus Shevchenko there. Shevchenko's from Asia. She's kickboxed in Thailand. I'm sure a couple of those people would travel over, but no, we have to put that in New York because we told them that we give them a certain number of title fights every year, You're never going to grow those markets and give those fighters that launch pad to be a star. Ireland and Boston were the locations of McGregor's big coming out parties. Topuria loves copying Conor McGregor, but he's a better fighter for sure. Maybe even one of the greatest fighters of all time. And there is a decent chance that he'll never get to fight in any of his home countries as a champion. Germany, Georgia, or Spain. Take your pick. And all of this is because of greed. These guys can't see the forest for the trees. Site fees are cool and all, but if you build compelling fights and fighters, that is a more consistent, renewable resource. That's easier. Arguably easier than convincing a city to give you a bunch of money is to just put a certain fighter in a city that makes sense, promote them in a way that makes sense to their fan base that would like them. The ticket prices for UFC 303 when McGregor was still on the card were a bit nutty, but at least it makes a bit of sense because he's a limited resource. Insane ticket prices for an event like Kansas City or something with a Gary Prates main event are just stupid because the UFC didn't put in the work to make them worth the asking price. There's been times where I think about it in my head and I'm like, maybe a monopoly isn't even that bad. One company having all the best production and talent, it makes things pretty simple. I guess that's okay. But then you start considering the downsides and things begin to get a little bit fucking insane here, boys. A company that doesn't have to innovate, they could charge whatever, do whatever, go wherever without any consequences. That just sucks. That just freaking grinds my gears. You want to know what grinds my gears? Monopolies. What's the UFC focused on right now? Growth. What's their plan to get there? Force people down our throats. Maybe even force some ideas down our throats. We're going to keep this relatively neutral, but politics have played an important role in the UFC's growth over the last decade. The early 2020s saw the pendulum swing to where the right-wing and right-wing ideas were counterculture and they were cool. And MMA, had always been this edgy sports property, but it largely stayed away from overt and in-your-face politics. It was at least kept on the back burner a little bit. The mid-2010s were when they kind of wanted to get away from the edginess, when they got the Reebok deal, the ESPN deal. Ronda Rousey, a woman, was the face of the edgiest sport on television. Then the UFC undergoes kind of this corporate makeover as well. My beloved Face the Pain is scrapped in favor of more general background music for events. The graphics become cleaner, that sort of thing. Everything gets sanitized. The UFC gained a significant amount of momentum because they didn't fully shut down due to COVID-19. That was sort of a political statement at the time, but it was also a business opportunity. And to their credit, they managed to make it work with a high level of safety, and their protocols and bubble models ended up paving the way for other leagues like the NHL to come back as well. Donald Trump and Dana White have been friends since the early 2000s, maybe even late 90s. Trump has been a proponent of the sport since the dark ages. He's not a poser, and I don't even really hate him showing up to events. I don't, maybe even know if I hate him getting an entrance. This is potentially the most famous man on earth. Other sports leagues would jump at the chance to show him on the broadcast and stuff like that. It also just so happens that walkouts are a big part of the UFC, so it fits neatly. There's bigger gripes to have with the product right now, in my opinion. But then, you start bringing out his whole cabinet, and it gets ridiculous. Elon Musk, who couldn't shoot virtual cops in a video game, is sitting front row acting like he's enjoying it. Oh, it's different, because it's not real, but it's real, but it's not real. It's video games, dude, get over it. And as time goes on, they seem to be reaching more and more into politics and the culture war. They got rid of, sponsors that were quote-unquote woke, whatever woke means. The woke mind virus has attacked my razors. Oh no, what will I ever do, So what happens when the pendulum inevitably swings back? Because it always does. That could lead to some pretty bad outcomes. an outcome where the United States moves to a more left-leaning place, or at least, maybe center-left for a decade, something like that, and the UFC is seen as this weird trend that's not in vogue anymore because it's so associated with Republican politics. Feels like they might shoot themselves in the foot a little bit there. They chose to be somewhat divisive, and they could potentially pay for it by alienating people in the future, just like how they've alienated people recently. There are quite a few things that the UFC is currently doing that do seem to be sort of short-sighted. It just feels like the UFC is starting to hit this critical mass where it's a really big deal attached to multi-billion-dollar organizations, and if it wants to continue to grow, it has to leave some people or maybe some tendencies behind. It has to decide how corporate and how political it wants to be. Me personally, I would like to see them split the difference because a completely apolitical corporate HR hellscape has no soul. And a super preachy company always kind of pushing their narrative on you, whether you agree with it or not, feels like they're just using you as a person to influence instead of entertain. As much as Dana's connections to Trump are valuable and the UFC wants to be a right-leaning company, I'm pretty confident that some of the suits in the TKO boardroom see him as a loose cannon. As someone who isn't super controllable, maybe I'm giving him too much credit, but the UFC has been his baby for multiple decades, and he's a guy who just says what he wants. He will call out other businessmen for their cocaine habits. Corporate people don't like that. He's a shithead, but he's our shithead, and there is a part of him that cares about fighters a little bit, and the product a little bit, and making big fights happen sometimes. Those weird backstage bonuses and quote-unquote taking care of fighters are a really strange system that is for sure flawed, but at least it's something. Dana comes from a working class family, had a single mother growing up, and on a certain level, I think he relates to a large chunk of the fighters on the roster who come from these less than ideal situations, maybe make drastic changes to their lives, and take risks that end up paying off. Not excusing all the shitty things he's done over the years, I could fucking make a big ass list. But there's a certain amount of soul that he offers the promotion that isn't easily controllable, and I don't know exactly how long Dana has. I feel like the White House card might be the culmination of everything he's been working towards. If the UFC was his baby, getting the UFC to the White House is like a sick ass play date that he's arranged. He's got tickets to a movie, amusement park, he's got candy, he's got snacks, he's got everything, I wouldn't be entirely surprised if he leaves shortly after, if he wants to bookend his legacy on this huge win, this huge event. All the signs right now are saying that the White House event is going to be really big, maybe one of, if not the biggest ever, and could maybe even kickstart the next big growth period for the UFC and the sport in general. But all those eyeballs come with a lot of scrutiny. No doubt the world will be watching, but are they going to like what they see? Are they going to like the presentation? Are they going to like the sport itself? Are they going to like Dana? Are they going to like the people involved? There's lots of moving parts, and if I'm TKO, I'm thinking, how can I mitigate disaster? How can I be as friendly to the public, as open to the public, just like other sports are, as possible, even though that's not MMA's identity, that's not in its DNA. That's the way that I feel they want to push it, right? What if the growth of MMA leads it to a place that we as a fan base don't really like? Certainly there's changes that would be very welcome. Some more freedom for independent journalists to do their job without the UFC revoking credentials. Have it be, truly a bastion of free speech. That's a big thing for Dana, make that call. Maybe the UFC has to make that call. Above his pay grade, they got to make that decision, right? More people could be looking into some of the shitty people that they have hanging around the roster. Maybe Cedric Dumas doesn't get to be here anymore when he has double-digit arrests. In a super corporate UFC, maybe that doesn't fly. Maybe that's a pro. Potentially some of MMA's issues regarding corruption and that sort of thing get weeded out. Or maybe they get worse. I don't even know. There's tons of pros and cons both ways, but even if those things get fixed, we still lose that edge even more than we already have. I came into the world of MMA in 2019, 2020, that sort of period of time, and I yearn for 2000s MMA. I am absolutely enamored by Jens Pulver and Carlos Condit, these guys that I have no business being a fan of. but it is partially helped by the time period and aesthetic in which they fought. That's why people like MMA. It's not only different from every other sport, it's different in a multitude of ways. It's more artistic, it's more creative, it's more violent, it's more real, it's more dynamic. That's why boxing is so boring to MMA fans. Fewer outcomes, less potential for something insane to happen on any given Saturday. That's why it attracts the people that it attracts. That's why it's compelling. And you can only change it so much. You can only replace so many elements before it's not MMA anymore. I don't know exactly where the line is, but I'd like to stop before we get close to it. Let me know your thoughts on the UFC and their future in the comment section below. Like, comment, and subscribe for more MMA content. Shout out to Shauna, Proletarian Gothic, Vanny, and Stu for being vampiric enjoyers. Thank you all so much for watching. Endless growth is impossible. Have a good time.